Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Imagine a doctor curing terminal malaria without a single drop of medicine. No hospital bed, no surgical intervention at all. Instead, the physician simply walks into the room, bypasses all the charting and diagnostics, and just issues a verbal legal eviction notice to the disease.
Right. And the illness complies instantly. It packs its bags and vacates the patient's body. The patient doesn't need to sleep it off or, go through physical therapy. She just stands up completely energized and goes right back to her daily routine.
Which sounds like a scene out of a fantasy novel, honestly.
It really does. I mean, modern medical science operates on the premise of gradual recovery. We fight biology with biology. We use chemical compounds to alter cellular responses over a sustained period.
Definitely.
The idea of a biological crisis responding to a legal decree is, well, it's completely foreign to our modern empirical framework.
But that is precisely the framework we're stepping into today. For this deep dive, we are examining just 3 brief verses from the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 31.
Yeah, it's such a brief text.
It is, but the sources on the table are 2 exhaustive, expository, and systematic treatises that analyze this single, fleeting event, the healing of Simon Peter's mother-in-law.
And our mission here is to unpack how this microscopic domestic crisis proves the absolute authority of Christ over both the physical consequences of the fall and the private, hidden lives of his people.
Yeah, because when you look at the research provided in these treatises, you realize how much weight Mark is placing on this one tiny moment. The authors break down the Greek syntax, the medical history of antiquity, and the massive theological implications of the king of creation stepping into a cramped, dusty bedroom.
It's fascinating. We usually want our miracles to be massive, undeniable spectacles.
Oh, for sure. We want the parting of the Red Sea. We want fire calling down from heaven on Mount Carmel, or, a stadium filled with people witnessing something that breaks the internet. We tend to associate divine intervention with public vindication.
But this analysis will show you why the quiet, hidden moments of your life, the domestic anxieties, the private illnesses, the closed-door crises, are under the very same sovereign oversight as the rotation of the planets.
Right. And the contrast Mark presents is staggering, and the treatises point this out immediately. Jesus has just left a highly public arena.
Yeah, he was in the synagogue in Capernaum. He had just silenced a demonic spirit in front of the entire religious establishment of the city. He astonished the crowds, and then, without taking a breath, without a victory lap, he walked straight out of that public building and into a private house.
Let's paint a picture of that setting. Because Capernaum in the first century was not some sleepy, irrelevant backwater village where nothing happened. We are talking about a bustling, high-traffic commercial hub on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
Definitely. There's a Roman garrison station there to keep the peace. There's a customs station, which means heavy taxation, government bureaucracy, and a constant flow of merchants passing through.
And that local synagogue where Jesus just performed the exorcism, the research brings out that it was actually built by a Gentile centurion. That alone shows the intense cultural and political mixing happening in this region.
The geopolitical tension there was constant. You have strict Jewish religious life bumping right up against Roman military occupation and international trade routes.
But what the treatises focus on is the specific living situation. People in Capernaum did not live in isolated private villas surrounded by manicured lawns and picket fences.
No, they lived in architectural structures called insulae. These are clusters of rooms built out of local black basalt stone, all arranged around a shared central courtyard.
Black basalt stone sounds incredibly hot in the Middle Eastern sun.
Oh, it was. It absorbed the heat. And the living arrangements were dense. Simon Peter's home was one of these insulae. It was multi-generational, bustling, and highly communal.
You had Peter, his wife, his brother Andrew, his mother-in-law, and very likely extended family, all living in an environment where privacy practically did not exist.
Right. The courtyard was where the cooking happened, where the animals were kept, where the daily chores were done. If something went wrong in one room, the entire complex felt the shockwave instantly.
So when a crisis hits, it hits the entire structural order of the home. You don't just close your bedroom door and suffer in silence while the rest of the house goes about its business. And that brings us to the medical reality facing this specific family.
The text says Peter's mother-in-law had a fever. Now, let me be honest. If I get a fever today, I take some over-the-counter medication, drink some electrolytes, and binge-watch a television show.
Yeah, it's an inconvenience. I might miss a day or two of work. I don't start drafting my will.
That is a modern luxury. In antiquity, a fever was a completely different beast. The authors of our sources pull from ancient medical authorities to explain this, specifically citing the Greek physician Galen and the Hippocratic corpus.
And in their medical understanding, a fever, the Greek word Mark uses is pyretos, was not viewed as a secondary symptom of an underlying infection like we view it today. It was classified as a consuming, independent disease in its own right.
Meaning the fever itself was the attacker, not just the body's alarm system going off because of a virus.
Spot on. They believed this internal fire actively destroyed the body's vital moisture. It was a life-threatening crisis.
To be bedridden with a pyritos often meant the onset of malaria or another terminal infectious agent endemic to the marshy regions around the Sea of Galilee. There were no antibiotics. There was no intravenous fluid therapy.
So the household of Peter was gripped by the terrifying reality of impending mortality. They were watching the matriarch of the family burn up from the inside out, and they had absolutely no medical recourse to stop it.
Add to that the religious reality of the day. It was the Sabbath. According to the rabbinic traditions, which the treatises mentioned were later codified in the Mishnah tractate Shabbat, there were strict, unbending regulations about what you could and could not do on the Sabbath.
Right. They strictly forbade medical aid on the Sabbath unless a person's life was actively slipping away in that specific current moment.
The rabbis debated the nuances of this endlessly. If someone had a chronic issue, or if the person could conceivably survive until sundown when the Sabbath ended, you had to wait.
You could not mix medicine. You could not administer treatments. You had to sit there and watch them suffer until the sun went below the horizon.
I cannot even fathom the pressure on that household.
Mm-hmm.
The mother-in-law was the matriarch. In that ancient Near Eastern culture, she was the one responsible for the hospitality of the home. Her illness paralyzed the entire social structure of the family.
Imagine a modern household losing its central pillar, say a single mother or the primary organizer of a large family, during a major high-stakes crisis. The laundry piles up, the meals stop, schedules fall apart, the children are unmoored, the vulnerability is total.
And this human vulnerability sets the stage for what happens next. They have the Messiah in their living room, and the woman who should be hosting him, preparing the meal and offering him a place to rest, is incapacitated.
That helplessness is the perfect canvas for sovereign intervention. The authors of the treatises transition from the historical background to the grammatical sequence of the miracle itself, and the Greek text here is astonishingly precise.
Mark uses his favorite urgency marker right away, the word euthys, which translates to immediately. Mark uses this adverb 41 times in his gospel. It demonstrates the unstoppable, driving momentum of Christ's mission.
There is no hesitation. Jesus does not sit down for a cup of tea and ask for a status report. The text says, euthys, they told him about her.
They bring the crisis straight to him. And then Mark describes her condition. The Greek verb the sources focus on is katekaito. It indicates an ongoing prostrate state.
She's pinned down by the illness. She cannot move. She's essentially a prisoner in her own bed. And the participle modifying her condition is pyrrhousa.
The participle pyrrhousa literally means on fire. Her body is being systematically consumed by this heat. What the treatises want the reader to grasp here is her total passivity.
Right. She is entirely passive in this scenario. She cannot initiate a conversation with Jesus. She cannot reach out to touch the hem of his garment like the woman with the issue of blood does later in Mark's gospel. She cannot even articulate a plea for help. She is just lying there, burning.
I want to focus on Jesus' response because the text says he approaches her. The Greek word is proselthon. Let's unpack the weight of that approach.
Well, under Levitical law, stepping into the contaminated sphere of a sick person carried severe social and religious implications.
The Levitical holiness codes were the absolute center of Jewish life. They dictate that contact with severe illness, skin diseases, or bodily discharges renders a person ceremonially unclean. It was a system of contagion.
If you touch something impure, that impurity transfers to you. A standard, respectable rabbi in the first century would keep his distance to maintain his ritual purity. He would not go near a bedridden woman suffering from an undiagnosed raging fever.
No, he would stand at the door, perhaps offer a prayer, and wait.
But Jesus does not stand at the door. He walks right up to the bed. And the theology presented in our sources highlights a monumental shift here. Jesus does not catch her defilement.
The contagion works in reverse. His absolute holiness obliterates her illness. His purity is not fragile. It does not need to be protected by distance. It is militant. It flows outward from him and destroys the corruption inside of her.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, militant purity. And he seals that action with physical contact. The text says he takes her by the hand. The Greek phrase is kratisas tas skeros.
This is not a gentle, sympathetic pat on the wrist. The verb krete implies an authoritative grip. He seizes her hand, he takes hold of her with strength, and then, the text says, he raises her up. The verb used here is ogeiron.
Wait, stop right there. The treatises spend a lot of time on that specific word, ogeiron. Why is that single verb so crucial to understanding what Mark is communicating?
The choice of ogeiron is critical because of how it is used elsewhere in the New Testament. This is the very same verb used later in Mark 16.6 for the physical bodily resurrection of Christ from the dead, when the angel tells the women, he is risen, or he is raised.
Oh, wow. So the authors argue that the Holy Spirit's inspiration of this specific word in this early healing narrative signals something massive.
Yes, every physical healing performed by Christ is a micro-anticipation of the final resurrection. It is a direct, calculated assault on death and physical decay. He is not just lowering her body temperature. He's demonstrating the resurrection life that will eventually conquer the grave itself.
That completely changes how you read the miracles. They aren't just parlor tricks to prove he is God. They are previews of the end of human history. Our sources also point out Mark's deliberate refusal to use another very common Greek word for healing, which is therapeu.
Right, that word implies a gradual medical recovery, a convalescence, or a therapeutic process. If Mark had used therapeut, a skeptic reading the text could argue her fever just naturally broke over time. Maybe the cool evening air helped.
Instead, Mark uses the word aphiemi to describe the fever leaving. The fever dismissed her.
Aphiemi is an intense, loaded term. It means to dismiss, to send away, or to legally release someone from an obligation. What makes it fascinating is that it's a standard theological term used elsewhere in the Synoptic Gospels for the legal forgiveness of sins.
The sending away of guilt, its application here to a physiological issue, a fever, demonstrates that Christ spoke to the sickness with the same imperial authority that he directed toward the unclean spirits in the synagogue just a few hours earlier.
I have to say, the word aphiemi is shocking in this context. To go back to my earlier analogy, it is like a judge sitting in a courtroom, listening to the charges against the defendant, and then slamming a gavel down and dismissing the case entirely.
Yeah, the fever literally has no legal right to stay in her body anymore. The jurisdiction has been revoked. But why does legal terminology matter so much for a biological sickness? It feels like we are mixing categories.
We are mixing categories, but for a very specific reason. It matters because it establishes causality and jurisdiction.
Yeah.
The treatises maintain that the fever is an intruder. It was a foreign invader brought about by the curse of the fall.
By using aphiemi, the text declares that Christ holds supreme jurisdiction over human physiology. He issues a legal decree from the bench of heaven, and the illness must pack its bags and leave instantly. There is no negotiation. There is no waiting for the immune system to kick in.
And this instantaneous nature of the healing brings up massive implications about how grace actually functions in the life of a believer. Which brings us directly to the theological core of the text.
We have a woman who is physically helpless. She's pinned down, unable to rise, unable to seek out Jesus, unable to even ask for help. Our sources argue this is not just a medical report, it is a vivid physical picture of total spiritual inability.
The theological concept the authors derive from this is monergistic grace. Let me break that down, because it is a technical term that can sound intimidating. Monergism means that the work of salvation, or in this specific case, the work of physical restoration, is entirely a one-sided divine effort.
The prefix mono means one, and ergon means work. One worker.
Right. The woman contributes absolutely zero effort to her restoration. She does not meet Jesus halfway. She does not take a step toward him while he takes a step toward her. Need precedes help. Christ acts before she has the capacity to do anything.
So it is the opposite of synergy, where two parties cooperate to achieve a goal.
Precisely. Synergy is like two people lifting a heavy couch together. Monergism is a doctor shocking a flatlining heart back to rhythm, or better yet, raising a corpse from a tomb. The dead person does not cooperate in their resurrection.
The fallen human soul, the authors argue, is just like this fevered woman, dead in trespasses and sins, utterly devoid of capability, burning with the corruption of original rebellion.
And look at how the disciples handle this situation. They do not rely on secular remedies. They do not run out into the marketplace to find the local physician who prescribes balancing the four humors with leeches and herbs.
No, they euthes immediately bring the issue to Jesus through intercession. They tell him about her.
They lay the burden at the feet of the king. And by doing so, this healing fulfills the ancient prophecy of Isaiah 53. Matthew's gospel, when recounting these same events in Capernaum, explicitly connects these healings to Isaiah's words.
He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. The authors of our treatises make a very strong point here. Sickness is not an arbitrary accident of nature. It is a direct structural consequence of Adam's original rebellion in the Garden of Eden. Disease exists because the cosmos is fractured by sin.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, so let me stop you there and push back on that idea. If sickness is tied to the fall, does that mean every single illness is a direct punishment for a specific individual sin?
Like if I get the flu tomorrow, or if someone listening gets a terrifying cancer diagnosis, is that because they harbored bitterness toward a neighbor last week? Is God punishing them with a tumor?
No, absolutely not. And the sources are very careful to clarify that point to avoid any cruel misunderstandings. While all sickness exists globally because the world has fallen under the curse of sin, individual illnesses are not necessarily direct, one-to-one punishments for personal sins.
Think of it this way. Humanity lives in a poisoned environment. The environment itself is toxic because of the fall. When someone gets sick, it is evidence of the toxic environment, not necessarily a divine lightning bolt aimed at a specific moral failure.
I see. So, going back to a medical analogy, it is like a doctor treating a systemic infection rather than just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom. If you have a severe infection causing a massive rash on your arm, you do not just put lotion on the skin.
The lotion might soothe the symptom, but the infection will still kill you. You administer an antibiotic that floods the entire bloodstream to kill the root cause of the rash.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. Jesus is not just wandering around Galilee dispensing lotion. He is acting in his office as mediator. He took on human nature specifically to endure the miseries of this life.
He absorbs the consuming fire of God's wrath on the cross so that the fever of sin, the root cause of all decay, can be dismissed from his people. The healing in this dusty bedroom is a typological shadow.
Let's unpack the phrase typological shadow for anyone who might not be familiar with it. A type is a preview, a foreshadowing of something greater to come. So, this miracle is not a guarantee of permanent earthly health for every believer right now.
If it were, Christians would never get sick or die. Instead, it is a prophetic signpost. It points forward to the new creation, to the end of the story, where all decay, all cancer, all fevers, and all grief are banished forever.
That is the highest hope presented in the text. And because this text reveals the true nature of Christ's authority, the treatises we are studying argue that it also functions as a sharp sword against false teachings in the modern visible church.
The authors pivot from the historical exposition to polemics, arguing that the text is historically objective, and it provides an uncompromising standard by which we should judge modern ecclesiastical movements.
I want to walk through the specific arguments the authors make here, because they take aim at some major targets. Let's start with the historical details. The passage explicitly identifies the woman as Simon Peter's mother-in-law. The Greek phrase used is pentherosimnos.
The sources utilize this very straightforward historical fact to refute the dogma of mandatory clerical celibacy. The logic is unassailable. If Simon Peter had a mother-in-law, he was a married man.
The treatises corroborate this by pointing to the Apostle Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 9.5, where Paul explicitly mentions that Peter, whom he calls Cephas, traveled with a believing wife. The authors argue that the imposition of mandatory celibacy upon church leaders throughout history completely contradicts the biblical reality of the apostolic circle.
Peter, the supposed first pope in some traditions, was married. Furthermore, the home, marriage, and domestic life are honored and sanctified by Christ's physical presence and intervention in that house.
The authors then move to their next critique. They point out that the healing is quiet, it is private, it is instantaneous, and it absolute. The response of the household is immediate intercessory prayer to Jesus, not pragmatic self-reliance.
Our sources contrast Christ's method here heavily with modern charismatic continuationism and the prosperity gospel movements.
The contrast drawn by the authors is stark. They argue that modern alleged healings often require an arena, emotional frenzy, mood lighting, manipulative music, and very often financial seed money from the congregation.
Furthermore, the authors point out that these modern events often result in partial or ambiguous outcomes. A patient might feel a surge of adrenaline, claim a healing, and then succumb to the illness a few weeks later, at which point they are often blamed for lacking enough faith.
That is incredibly destructive pastoral malpractice.
The treatises agree. They use Merck's text to demonstrate that Christ's miracles were undeniable and absolute. There was no convalescence, there were no partial healings. The woman was not blamed for her fever.
The authors maintain that these miraculous signs were specific, unrepeatable credentials for the apostolic era. They functioned to verify the spoken word of Christ and his apostles before the closing of the biblical canon. They were not normative models for everyday church gatherings.
The text is also used by the authors to critique another modern movement, seeker-sensitive pragmatism. They argue that Jesus does not need a theatrical stage to prove his sovereignty.
He literally walks away from the astonished, eager crowd in the synagogue to heal an elderly woman in an obscure, cramped room where no one else can see him.
But let me play devil's advocate here. I read that section of the treatises, and I found myself wondering, is reading an indictment of modern megachurch marketing pragmatism into a story about a first-century fever a bit of a stretch? Are the authors projecting 21st century church growth debates onto Mark chapter 1 just to score theological points?
It is a very fair question to ask of the author's methodology. However, the sources defend this application by focusing on the deliberate geographical choices Mark highlights. Jesus intentionally transitions from the highly public sphere to the deeply private one.
The authors argue that if his primary goal was pragmatic crowd building or maximizing his platform, he would have brought the sick woman into the synagogue, or he would have performed the healing in the town square with maximum visibility.
By doing it in the domestic space, away from the cameras, so to speak, he proves that divine efficacy does not require human marketing or showmanship. The sheer unadorned word of the king is sufficient to accomplish his will.
That rationale holds up. He governs the quiet spaces just as fiercely as the public ones. He doesn't need an audience to be sovereign. Now, with that theological foundation set and the author's critiques addressed, the treatises shift their focus to application.
How were the original readers meant to respond to this truth? And how should you, the listener today, respond? To understand the application, we have to consider the original audience reading Mark's gospel. The historical consensus is that Mark wrote this account for Christians living in Rome during the 60s and 70s AD.
This is a crucial detail. These believers were facing brutal, state-sponsored persecution under the Roman Emperor Nero.
Nero was a complete tyrant. We were talking about believers who were hiding in underground catacombs or secretive house churches. They were terrified of being dragged into Roman amphitheaters, thrown to wild animals for public entertainment, or, as the Roman historian Tacitus recorded, being covered in pitch and burned as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night.
The sheer terror of that existence is unimaginable. So why did Mark, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, include this specific story about a domestic fever for that terrified Roman church?
The authors argue that Mark included it to show them the true scale of their king's dominion. Those persecuted believers needed to know that the emperor's might, as terrifying as it was absolutely nothing compared to Christ.
The logic is one of lesser to greater. If Christ can effortlessly control a microscopic fever in a Galilean bedroom with a single touch, issuing a legal decree to biology itself, then he completely controls the massive basalt-like structure of the Roman Empire.
The political authorities, even Nero himself, could only destroy life. The messianic authority of Jesus Christ could restore it effortlessly. Nero is not sovereign. The man who banished the Paretos is sovereign.
And we see the proof of that life-restoring authority in the woman's immediate response. The text says the fever left her and she began to minister to them. The Greek word used for ministering is diakone, from which we get the word deacon.
It is an imperfect active indicative verb denoting continuous, ongoing labor. She did not just get up and say thank you, she went to work.
From a purely physiological standpoint, the treatises point out that the physical stamina required to prepare a meal and provide hospitality for several adult men immediately after suffering a life-threatening fever is the ultimate medical proof of the miracle.
Think about how the human body works. When a natural fever finally breaks, the body is left exhausted. The patient is dehydrated, physically weak, dizzy, and usually requires days of rest and fluids just to be able to stand up without fainting.
But here, the restoration is so absolute, so comprehensive, that she possesses pristine physical strength instantly. There is zero recovery time.
This brings us to a massive theological application regarding the nature of salvation. Deliverance from the curse of sin requires an active response of gratitude. The sources address the theological plague of East believism and antinomianism.
Let's define antinomianism. Anti means against, nomos means law. It is the false idea that you can receive the grace of God, be forgiven of your sins, and then live however you want, remaining entirely passive or even openly rebellious because, hey, I'm under grace, not law.
The treatises utterly dismantle antinomianism using this text. Grace empowers obedience. It does not nullify it. The theological concept the authors lean on heavily here is the third use of the moral law.
Let me explain that. The law functions for the believer not as a system of merit to earn justification. We cannot earn our salvation, just as the woman could not cure her own fever. But once we are saved by grace alone, the law acts as an infallible rule of direction to guide our grateful obedience.
It is like the steering wheel of a car. The steering wheel does not make the car move. Grace is the engine that provides the drive, but the steering wheel shows you how to stay on the road. Salvation turns passive consumers into active laborers.
The sequence in the text is unalterable. First, Christ comes. Second, Christ touches. Third, the fever leaves. And fourth, she labors for them. Grace always precedes obedience, but grace always, without exception, produces obedience.
If there is no diakoné, no continuous labor of love, it calls into question whether the fever of sin has actually been dismissed. That is the hard truth the authors draw from the narrative. The evidence of the cure is the labor.
Let me bring this directly to you, the listener. What does it look like to have a domestic crisis today? It might not be a first-century life-threatening fever. It might be a failing marriage where the communication has completely broken down.
It might be a wandering child making destructive choices that keep you awake at night. It might be a frightening medical diagnosis that leaves your entire family reeling, sitting in the sterile doctor's office waiting for the results.
In those moments, what is your first instinct? Our culture has an addiction to self-help. We are trained to look inward for hidden strength, to buy another book, to consult every secular authority, or to rely on our own pragmatic wisdom before we ever drop to our knees.
This passage, the authors argue, calls for a total rejection of that self-reliance. Need always precedes help. We must recognize our complete inability to cure our own spiritual and structural fevers. We must abandon the illusion of control and rest entirely upon the monergistic grace of the Savior, who is willing to step into the contaminated, chaotic spaces of our private lives.
The disciples did not strategize. They brought the problem directly to Jesus. So, synthesizing this entire progression from the treatises, we move from total human helplessness, pinned down by a curse we cannot break, to a sovereign intervention by a king who ignores religious theatrics and mechanical legalism, to a complete, instantaneous restoration that results in continuous, grateful ministry.
Christ's authority is not confined to public buildings or Sunday morning gatherings. It invades our private suffering on a Tuesday afternoon. The transition Mark records from the public synagogue to the private bedroom is a deliberate theological declaration.
The king who claims the nations, the one who silences demons in public, is the very same Savior who cares for the solitary, suffering member of his covenant family. There is no boundary to his dominion, and no detail of your life is too mundane for his oversight.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you go about your week. The text is clear. Peter's mother-in-law was completely healed that day. The fever was legally dismissed, her strength returned entirely, and she labored for her guests.
But eventually, years or decades later, she still died. The physical decay of the fall eventually caught up with her earthly body. If this flawless divine healing in Capernaum was only temporary, just a shadow of things to come, how much more glorious must the permanent, eternal bodily resurrection be when the king finally returns to banish the curse forever?
Keep studying the text on your own.
And thank you for joining us on this deep dive.